Thank you, everybody, for joining us here. It's going to be a conversation like a good meetup should be. So we're going to be really relying on you to come off mute and share your thoughts as we go through this process, because we are deliberately not going to beat you with slides today. It's a horrible thing. Nobody wants that, and we'll move forward past that. But it's going to require your participation. Why don't we go to the agenda and talk through a little bit about what to expect for today? We're going to start with about a half hour around transformation strategy. We want to take your questions, get your comments and your thoughts. I did title it a provocative little tETLTt again. So we'll talk about why I did that. And then we're going to break out. And thank you to everyone who voted on the top 3 things that we want to break out and talk about. So we'll move you right through the breakout sessions into a sort of a smaller group of people to talk about more specific content. Then we'll come back, talk a little bit about what we saw there, do some chit chat, some Q&A, wrap it up, and hopefully it'll be helpful for everybody and a little bit of fun and not too formal. Let us know what you think of that. So why don't we go into the next slide really quickly and talk through this idea of transformation. The idea behind this particular meetup and this conversation, which again, hopefully is more conversation than lecture, was a discussion Callum and I were having, and Gina and I were talking too about transformation and where you transform versus where you need as much granularity as possible. I know we've got some people on that work at various BI organizations, and I come from that space too. And so there's this real question of not just when do I transform, but how do I separate transformations by where they are? So I put this very basic graphic, which looks like it got a little weird down at the bottom. Think of it as the life cycle of data. From creation to consumption, data goes through this pipe. And it starts, maybe we collect it in transactional database, or we stage it in a staging database, or we throw it into a lake, and then it ends up in a data warehouse, maybe then to a data mart or an operational data store or a cube, or maybe we leave it granular and we transform in a query. And so that this comes to this question as that Cal and I were talking about, right? Should we transform it on query? Because I'm leave the transforms to the latest possible time. That's my theory, because I, as a data person, want it as granular and as untouched as possible at the end. And you had some opinions about whether we should transform into the EDW versus doing it afterwards on query time and when we do that. And then I brought up transforming in the transactional database. So I'll let you talk. Everyone hop in on the Slack, on the chat, and let us know your thoughts as we go through.
Thank you for the introduction. Nice to see everyone on the call. My name is Callum. I'm a solutions architect over at Sisu Data. But to continue off that conversation, we were having this discussion on where transactions should live. Joel mentioned on query. I think dbt has been the most influential piece of technology that I've worked with in my career. It's helped propel me forward. So I am so rooted in that particular space of all transformation should occur within the data warehouse. And then when Joel mentioned transforming data in the transactional database, I had a little bit of a conniption and it triggered me a little bit. And then I stopped myself and tried to think of a situation where that would actually be the right case. And he came up with a couple of examples, but coming from the space that I have, I'm fully in the do all your transformations in the data warehouse, don't do them anywhere else. And then this is actually the topic or the discussion that led to my breakout room, if anyone's interested, which is the metrics layer, because obviously that is a part of transformation. And so if anyone is interested in continuing that conversation, join the breakout room later, but I'll pass it back over to Joel.
Yeah, let's work forwards and talk about that really weird use cases around transactional databases or places where we're staging that data as we first collect it. So you and I talked about a couple of use cases. So I went online and poked around and I found a really solid one where the first place where data is aggregated and collected in that data repository, whatever you might call it, transactional database, et cetera. So Colin, the really interesting use case I saw was games, mobile gaming, where you might have users with multiple versions of that game, and the data that's been collected off of it is coming in slightly different forms. And you're using a tool to analyze that data that's looking at the historical data in the EDW, which is easy to normalize, standardize, and transform a little bit there, but also pulling the last days out of that transactional database, the last days worth of data, scores and usage out of there. So you need to do potentially some normalization either in that database, so what you're storing is consistent, or at the time you pull it out of that database, so that what you're pulling out is consistent with the other data sets. So it's an interesting thought where the article I was reading was about 4 or 5 different versions of games that are storing in slightly different, they have different developers, they're storing in slightly different formats, and then you're trying to reconcile those as they land in the transactional database.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that coincides very nicely. There's two individuals on the call, sort of live in the reverse ETL movement that's generally been bubbling up over the past couple of years. And I'd love to hear from them on what is the line of demarcation between you've got a mobile game, and if you need to do a summary of the user statistics at the end of the day or something like that, should that live in the application? Or is that something that should be part of the reverse ETL job? Like, where does that line of separation exist that it should be reverse ETL versus it should be all in application? I can volunteer people unless they want to raise their hand and step out. Cool. Yep.
Called me out effectively. I think, first of all, there's a wealth of transformation that occurs from an app to within an app. Let's make sure that we all understand that, right? Engineers are effectively transforming data in the app by definition. And like the transactional DB is acting as not just as a store, but as a computation engine for an app. So I think the first clear, obvious answer is if the information necessary needs to be joined from some completely different system, then that really pushes you, I think, towards do those joins and do that unification and analysis and metricing and aggregation in the warehouse is what I would say. As soon as you're dealing with kind of disparate applications, it gets maybe a little trickier when the applications are very co-located, so to speak. There are two teams that are like next to each other, two engineering mobile teams that are making mobile games next to each other, and they may have a way to communicate to each other that's actually really efficient, but you're probably still going to have to then write that down and explain as it goes out to the analytics team. So why bother? So I think if you find yourself doing something where you're gonna have to then document that and replicate it, then don't. Those are my rules of thumb, but I'm not like draconian that I think no work should happen in an application.
Boris, I think that's a really good point. Do we see logical reasons why it might make sense to transform really early or at least aggregate and normalize, right, early? And the answer is yes. And then the next question is, should you do it? And the answer is heck no. Do everything you possibly can to avoid it. Yeah. But maybe it becomes the case that you want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you should bias away from it, obviously. Application logic may just be the most intuitive way to do that in a single app often. But when you're dealing multiple apps, I think, which was the example you gave, right? Like these are a variety of mobile games, let's say. It seems unlikely that you'd want to do that in app.
Yep. I want to pass it over to Allegra here, who had a really good comment in the Slack channel. I don't mean to call you out, but it's a really good point.
No, sure. And I'm, of course, biased because I'm here to represent the metrics layer, metrics store, which is a way to manage metric definitions, not at the BI layer, nor in the warehouse. It's an intermediary layer. And the reason for why I think that's important is because a certain amount of transformation does need to happen in the warehouse. Normalization and cleaning up of raw data sets. Usually you're keeping those data sets at sort of the same level of granularity as the raw data. And of course, you can create roll-ups, daily, weekly, rolling 7-day, weekly tables for, say, active users metrics. But usually what you need is these roll-up tables that are going to be sliced and diced by different dimensional values. And the sort of permutations of how many different aggregates you'll need sliced by those different dimensions are too complex and too many in number to be able to pre-compute within the warehouse. And so really what you want is a way to dynamically create those metrics on the fly, but not have those be stored and inaccessible to other applications if you're doing that at the BI layer.
Thanks for chiming in. I think Allegra's point was a really good one about granularity, right? So if you look at the slide really quickly, granularity goes down from the lake to the cube, right? As a transformation goes up, that historic approach to how we move from more granular to less granular. And Allegra, I liked your point that you might do some work at the transactional layer, but you tend to not lose the granularity. You're doing normalization, you're doing cleaning, but not granularity change at that point. And so that's super important. And I think from a metric layer perspective, we start looking at it much further down the other side of the pipe. Oh, thanks you, Cal. I'm seeing that somebody put in, what is a cube? Highly transformed set of data across multiple axes. You might hear hypercube when you get to more than 3 different axes of data. Yep. So that's in the Slack if everybody's in there. So I think it's really important to think that when you're transforming at a transactional layer, it's not maybe what we think of traditionally as transformation. We're not doing aggregation. We're deliberately trying to not reduce granularity so that it moves into the lake. I think the other really important thing that is changing in the industry is that this lake warehouse data mart construct is either going away or converging in evolution, depending on how you look at it. So if you've got one of these big cloud databases and it has got the ability to look into just a storage bucket and also be an EDW and also hold lots of different logical units of data, you can have highly transformed, non-granular schemas at the same time it's holding essentially data lake data and able to query that as well. So we end up with logical constructs inside one entity that can be addressed via one entity that is both highly transformed and not highly transformed, and granular and not highly granular. And so often that comes down to a clean granular data set for maybe data science to work with, a cubed data set for quick analytics work on the BI side, and every step in between. So I think that's a super important aspect of what's happening in the database world these days. I don't think in 3 years there'll be a difference between a data lake and a data warehouse from an operational perspective. I don't know if that's provocative or not, Colin.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I agree with you. And I think the line of separation between data lake and data warehouse is just going away even more. I saw there was a release by Snowflake, I think it was this morning or it might've been this week, where they're now beginning to support photos and movie files and everything like that. So it's all going to be the same in a couple of years. And I think you're totally right on that.
Yeah, so let's look at this construct, this deliberately provocative construct to tELTT. I was listening to an Andreessen Horowitz podcast, about a year or two ago, and it was talking about, do I transform before it hits the EDW? Do I transform after it's in the EDW? And we all have perhaps some set of opinions about that, but I think the reality is it makes sense in both cases in a different place. And the acronym I heard was E little t L big T, right? So you move it into the EDW and then you do transform and you make a second logical construct of data that's more transformed, and they're both reside in the EDW at the same time. And then I added those little T's on the end because I think that there's a potential to do it on both sides from an ETL perspective. So
there's also, I can't remember this, and maybe some of the folks from dbt Labs can chime in if they're aware, but I think I remember Jeremy having a talk at Coalesce last year where he talked about ELT and then another couple of letters. So I think it's a pretty persistent idea that there's more than just the 3 letters. Now, where they exist is a separate bit entirely.
Yeah, so we have this wonderful first question, which is where and when is it best to transform data? And the answer is yes, right? There's a place that makes sense in most of these, but what is the best practice? And I think the modern best practice for transformation is we try and do as much of it in one place as possible, because there's so many things going on that it makes manageability higher. And traditionally that place is the EDW. But I think that there is this business logic layer, which is where you, Cal, and I were talking about the metrics side. Where do we define KPIs? Where do we define metrics? That I think sits on top of that, the transform data in the EDW, because when you do a transformation, you really are impacting granularity. And so at some point you want to make available the highly granular data to an end user analytics team that's going after that data. So
yeah,
some of those metrics have to be outside of the EDW for accessibility today. I just don't think there's a tool right now that makes it super easy to use it in the EDW.
I'd love to ask the community and everyone who's on the call. The last time I was at a dbt meetup was the Chicago meetup, because that's where I am now. I'm moving to San Fran. But when I was at the Chicago meetup, there was an organization there who was talking about building out the idea of a metrics layer actually within a table in the data warehouse. So I wanted to maybe pass it off to anyone else who's interested in talking. Is there a particular method that you have used in order to aggregate all of your transformations in a single location? Have you found it to be valuable to you? Have you found it to not be valuable to you? Have you stepped away? If there's anyone that's interested in talking about that or giving their particular perspective, I'd love to hear it.
Callum, we actually use dbt to generate for the metrics that we care about, actually in the warehouse, in a table, create all the periods that we care about. We basically have a single piece of code in dbt that will take the periods we care about. So that's like monthly, daily, weekly, etc. So yeah, that takes the metrics we care about, the types of events that we care about or aggregations that we care about, combined with the periods that we care about, and generates a single table that has all of those in it. And then as an analyst, you basically can just, it's a very large table, but you're actually just selecting the thing that you want out of it by just filtering the period and the metric that you care about. So that's our rudimentary version of this.
Yeah, thanks, Boris.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. If I'm understanding you correctly, you said it was all dates you were interested in and then the particular metric and the results on that period of time. Do you find that the lack of dimensionality of not being able to see it with those cuts that Allegra mentioned earlier in the talk, does that impact the amount that your team uses it? Or have they just said, oh, it's totally fine with us, we don't need those dimensions?
So Callum, I would say these are not like annoying. Allegra's 100%. If you just give people, here's metric last 7 days, then that's really frustrating when you want last 14. But what we have is the number for every period basically generated. So we have daily, hourly, monthly, weekly, we have all those generated. So what's missing is if you wanted to take that metric over a 5-day period in a really interesting span, then yeah, this doesn't solve for that. So it's definitely limiting. There's no question. But for a lot of, let's say, trend graphs over those metrics, we're giving you arbitrary resolutions you can zoom by, and that's enough. And if you wanted
Definitely
to add a new
sense.
resolution, that's not hard. You add a new period resolution definition, and then you just generate that.
Yeah, makes sense.
We've damped our crosstalk conversation here a little bit, Boris. Sorry about that. If you want to share some of your thoughts here too, that's super helpful. I particularly appreciated what you were saying about the difference between transformation and business logic. Adam Rubinstein had something interesting in the Slack about the transforming to reduce climate impact, which was something I had not even thought about. Adam, I have not clicked on that link, but if you wanted to share what it says, I'd love to hear at least a synopsis. I think it might be relevant to our conversation here.
Hey, so the summary of that article, and honestly, like I haven't read too much into all the sources they listed, but if you are ELing all the data all the time into Warehouse, you are contributing a little bit more than you need to towards like greenhouse gas emissions. How much? I'm not sure. But it's apparently data centers are a large part of emissions these days, and they're predicted to grow. So it's something that might be a consideration.
Adam, if that's true though, right? Like it's actually the compute that would probably be the real problem. So
Yeah,
it's
I would
not
think
the
that.
selling, it's the constantly transforming.
Yeah, there was something mentioned about data storage too, but yeah, you're probably right that the bulk of it's compute.
Yeah, I think we probably want to ask ourselves whether or not we want to be collecting data that we're choosing not to transform and use. It might be that the IoT aspects are what's really sucking the greenhouse gases out rather than anything we do with it after collection.
I think you can get even more meta, Joel, right? Because I remember a friend of mine talking about cat videos were such a huge waste of carbon. And I'm like, they're fairly efficient technically. And what would we be doing otherwise? Which might be much worse. So maybe we're busy transforming data and it's actually
yeah, I don't know what the carbon footprint is of actual cats. It might be that the videos are more efficient than the cats themselves.
I wonder if there's a way that individuals within the dbt community would be able to calculate this with a seed file of the particular carbon offset of, I'm coming from a Snowflake background, so I'm thinking Snowflake here, but if you have a rough estimate of the carbon cost of an hour of a small warehouse, and then you're able to run that against your dbt metadata as it now exists, you might be able to come up with a chart of the carbon cost and then maybe try and optimize for that. I don't know. I'm throwing ideas out there for anyone.
I mean, you're describing, Callum, I think you're describing what people have called carbon tax, and we should just put that into the price. But yes, so. I think carbon offsets, dbt like plugin or package would be really neat. Every time you run this, it's like have the company spend on some offsets.
As with all good conversations, we're beginning to go a bit far, not to to step on that. I want everyone to continue to please provide your input there in both the Slack again. You've got the link in the chat, and then also in the chat itself if you're interested. I know that Allegra and Callum were talking a lot about metric aggregation. And what Pedram was talking about was the difference between transformation business logic, right? Business logic is a little bit more user-focused. It is possible that it makes more sense to have that in a centralized location because the business logic needs to be ultra consistent across the whole org, whereas transformation can take place in multiple places because it is not necessarily the same as business logic. If we conflate transformation with metric definition, then I think EDW is a solid place to do it, or one place is a place to do it. But if transformation includes things like normalization, cleaning, aggregation, and movement, then it's going to take place throughout the stack. Does that make sense, Callum?
Yeah. I wish Pedram were still here because I'd love to ask him a little bit more on the transform versus business logic and the separation of the two. How has that changed in his opinion with the advent of dbt? Because I think in the stacks that I worked with before dbt, your business logic and transformation were like a lot more separated because the transformation had to exist as part of some SSIS job or something like that. And sure, the SSIS job had a bit of that transformation SQL written in it. But in the reality is most of those stacks that I was working with, the transformation or the aggregation to a metric existed in the BI tool. And I think from my experience, we've been able to take that a little bit take a step back and tie business logic and transformation a lot closer together. So I'd love to maybe open it up to anyone who has opinions.
I think the line's gonna get real blurry, Callum. I like, it's all just code, right? At some levels. So I don't know what you define as the separation. Is it in a logical namespace sense, or is it in a stages of modeling sense? But I assume, just so we agree on definitions, right? So there's things like removing deleted stuff or removing deprecated data from a data set. Then there is concatenating names so that they're all normalized to a certain style. And then there is agreeing that a user activation is actually the result of these 3 events and not these 2 events. Would we agree like these are the kinds of things we're talking about here?
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
To transforming to BI. I think, right, Allegra, you're still here, right? Like, I think the metrics layer is not trying to solve that last category of like business logic of defining what a, let's say, user activation is versus solving arbitrarily looking at a single metric over time. I don't know how you create a hard line rule between these things, honestly.
Yeah, I noticed that, Damon, I think you had your hand raised. Did you have something you wanted to say on that?
It was verbatim what Boris had just said. Our team came from Flexport, and it was like a very similar experience where we had Looker and a lot of the business logic and transformation happened at the LookML layer. But as you continue these layers, like the metrics layer as well as dbt, what we're noticing a lot is like a separation of dbt for the modeling itself, and business logic gets conflated a lot, where there's like general metrics definition for the business logic, but as well as do you concatenate names, like what's the translation for like business user? And as you progressively get further and further away, like business logic needs to be clearly defined. And even like at a metrics layer, how one part of the org as you grow defines a specific metric is different than another part of the org. Like how finance might define one metric might be different than, and so it's like,
maybe this is the real thing. I think like, it's like, where do you have to compromise? So there's something you can iterate on without compromising, leave it in your own little silo, whatever tool you want to use, right? It's like you can iterate on it all day long. Like, we're going to try this activation metric. No, this activation, who cares? But if it's something where people have to compromise, like revenue, where it's like your CFO and your CRO and your CMO have to agree, and they're all going to be equally unhappy, is roughly how this works out. But then you should treat it differently.
The revenue was like the exact example that came to mind. But yeah, exactly.
I think consistently, there's one problem we haven't solved well as an industry because we're thinking of it in a linear pattern. And that is, we're good at solving sort of the macro first and then letting people iterate on the micro as it gets more specific with time. But we're not good technology structure around promotion from specific back into the main line. Going from saying, I discovered this thing out in my department about activation. How do I get it back to the team in a programmatic way that says, hey, this should probably be a thing that gets transformed and instantiated in the EDW for everyone. I think we're much better at saying, here's what's in the EDW, now go play, rather than I found a thing playing, now let's put it back in the EDW.
But Joel, I agree with you, but you're thinking about it from the physical infrastructure perspective and team separation. But I think if we get more and more people across every role in a company to understand code as a general concept and like a pull request as a general concept, then I think we have to create that culture and that education for everyone. And then if you figure that out in your team, there's a more simple kind of cultural pathway to get the code migrated up. And then the infrastructure part, hopefully can all just be.
Yeah, so it's less infrastructure. I'm just saying we're much better at branching than merging. And honestly, merging is harder. It's probably a law of thermodynamics that it's harder.
Entropy. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. I like this. I never thought of it in that simple way, Joel. I like that.
We're at about the 45-minute mark, and we were going to try and break out. We sent out earlier a vote on some of the things to talk about, including how do you separate your transformations, more about this metric layer and how that works, and then this product versus service model. These were the 3 winners of the votes. That worked surprisingly seamlessly. And we definitely have to say thank you to Opiyemi and Chandra for being willing to talk and chat through stuff with us. It made a big difference for us.
Awesome. I'm sure Opiyemi shared with you, but we're planning a meetup in Lagos next month. So I'm really glad he was able to join us.
We're talking a little bit about how he structured his database and dbt work. And it's like the perfect case of having done it right the first time. The way that it's segmented into raw and dev and prod, and good stuff.
Good.
Excellent. I guess I'll start because I'm session 1. So what we were talking about is staging databases, database or data warehouse, data marts, and how we separate those transformations. And I think what was really interesting is Opiyemi, who was one of the people in our breakout, was talking about doing that all in one database now and logically separating it. In BigQuery, separating it by project into a raw, dev, and production, essentially schemas. So that, and in between that, using dbt to do those transformations so that it's nice and logically separated there. And we had Chandra also in our breakout who was talking about putting the data that's raw into an S3 bucket and then doing the transformation, moving out of the S3 bucket into Snowflake in the Amazon ecosystem. It's interesting that there's 2 big approaches here of separating essentially by actual database versus logically inside one database. And I would say my thought on that is that it's becoming really cheap to do it all in one database these days. And I think we'll see convergence as we go forward. But what that does, put it all in one database, the trade-off might be some of the innovation that's coming from the individual databases you might otherwise choose.
Great. For our breakout room, we had, as are all good discussions, a wandering talk. We started with the metrics layer, discussing what problems it could potentially solve for, what problems it might not solve for, which then took a little left turn into, is the problem that we were discussing data democratization, how one might possibly address that. Then we got into market trends, given I'm going to steal someone, I believe Tristan's, Cambrian explosion of number of tools in the marketplace. Given that we're seeing that right now, are they eventually going to condense? What's that going to look like? And yeah, it was a great wandering discussion of a lot of like-minded people. And thank you everyone who took part in my breakout room. And the article that I mentioned right at the end, I have shared in the Slack channel.
Cool. And for session 3, what we talked about, I'll give you everyone a TLDR, but is basically data team as a service versus as a product, right? So should they be more transactional, filling out tickets, requests, etc., or should they be more strategic, like aligning some with marketing or product to try to figure out what the company OKR would be? We had a couple of inputs from Donnie, Adam, Mary, and Erica talking about how, for instance, Donnie has seen that service accounts, service process shifted to more of a product, but to find line between asking or answering a request and being able to be more strategic and tying yourself with that marketing OKR or goal, whatever it may be.
Great. Any other final thoughts?
For anybody.
I'm Gina from Sisu, so full disclosure. The plan was to have something actually, an office where we can actually talk to people and eat and drink, but I think with the numbers the way they were, we just went conservative. Please sign up again. We will actually have a physical event.
Gina, I would love to actually pass it on to you for the next slide.
Yeah, so we have Future Data. It's happening on October 13th. It's a free virtual event, so please take a look at futuredata.org. We're super excited about this one. We have a lot of awesome speakers, and we actually have some really good panel and fireside chats happening. Go check out the website so you can choose what you want to hear and content you want to be a part of.
A huge thank you to our Sisu Data team. Great content today. And also to everyone else who's still part of this meeting. As mentioned, this was initially going to be an in-person meetup. Whenever it's safe, we'll let you know. And we hope to connect with you in person again.